So, a workplace investigation is not about finding someone guilty. I know that may sound obvious, but conducting a defensible, neutral investigation is harder than you think in ways you may not expect. I'm Andrea Adams, and today on the HR Hub, we have again Bob Stenhouse. Bob was the guest on my most popular episode to date. He's the head of Veritas Solutions and a former police officer turned workplace investigator. He and I are going to be walking through the steps of a high standard investigation, which it may not make you an expert, but it will surely ensure or help you ensure that your process is sufficient and objective. Hi, Bob. How are you?
Good morning, Andrea. Thanks for having me on. I'm doing well. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. Okay, so I've even taken your investigation course. So some of this I better not be news. Okay. So can you walk me through the components of a workplace investigation?
Yeah, absolutely, Andrea. So, what we teach on our workplace investigations training is there's six basic components of a workplace investigation. And no matter how complex or no matter how serious, could be a low seriousness, maybe kind of a small level conflict issue versus highly serious, could be a sexual harassment or a sexual touching, sexual assault. The components of an investigation are all the same. There is an initiating event. Now, the initiating event could be a formal complaint. It could be something happening on in the news. It could be something happening on social media that initiates or triggers a response from the organization to say we have a responsibility to investigate. Like I said, it could be a formal complaint, could be any manner in which it comes in. So you have initiating event. Then we identify your parties, and your parties are generally in a workplace investigation. They're generally related to person on person allegations of misconduct. And that could be everything from harassment, bullying, which are different, by the way, sexual harassment, discrimination, any of the person on person interactions that are a breach of policy or law. So you identify your parties. It could be a complainant, could be a respondent, could be witnesses, it could be a reporter, someone that's just reporting what they know and understand happened. And then you start to gather your evidence, and that means your interviews. That means any other evidence that some of the parties might have, such as text messages or screenshots or emails. So you start to gather all of your evidence. And then you weigh and analyze that evidence. That's your fourth component. And when you weigh and analyze the evidence, you use what's called, we're going to talk about in a little bit, called the standard of proof, the balance of probabilities. And you start weighing out your evidence. And then the last is you come to a finding. We generally have three possible findings. One is founded, one is unfounded, and one is, some people call it unsubstantiated. We have a different term, but in other words, we couldn't come to a finding. And so those are the possibilities. Generally, the founded or unfounded, based on the balance of probabilities, is 99% of our investigations that we are able to come to a finding. And then lastly, it's not necessarily a component of the investigation, but it's a component of the organizational response, and that is a discipline sanction if there is a finding of misconduct. So that means, what do we do after we came to a finding? Okay, someone's alleged to have engaged in this behavior. We found that they did engage in that behavior, and then we have to do something with them. So that's that discipline sanction piece. Only applies in a founded allegation, of course. Those are the six components of every investigation that we conduct in the workplace. And again, sometimes the complexity or the seriousness makes it a little bit more challenging, but the six components are the same.
There was a number of things you said in there that was a bit surprising to me. The first was that the news can trigger an investigation. I know
Mhm.
that this is really not the focus of this, but how does that work?
Well, whether it be news or whether it be social media, as an example, is that what we're seeing is that some people are airing their grievances
Oh,
in the public domain. So if someone makes a complaint that actually, it's related, that it's newsworthy, That could actually be the triggering event where the organization says, "Well, we have this in the news. We have an obligation to investigate." I'll give you an example. We also do sport investigations, and within sport investigations, there's whether it be the news or whether it be, like I said, social media or even just chat platforms. If someone makes an allegation that is out in the public domain, let's say something serious like a sexual abuse type of situation, the organization has a duty of care and a fiduciary responsibility to get to the bottom of it. So they may choose to use that. I call it an initiating event.
Right.
And like I said, it could be a formal complaint. It could be something that we've seen one initiating event where it was an Instagram group where people were anonymized on the Instagram group and they were making allegations against a professor in a university. And the
Oh,
organization used that as the triggering event to launch an investigation.
right. Okay. The next question you said that thing you said was that harassment and bullying aren't the same thing. In
Mhm.
Alberta, which is where you and I are, they changed the legislation so that it talks about violence and harassment. Bullying isn't front and center the way it used to be. So, quickly again, because this is a sidebar question, what's the difference?
Well, harassment is the overarching umbrella, right? And it's
Yeah.
clearly defined. Something happened, someone should know, or ought reasonably should know, would cause offense, humiliation. Bullying is not defined in Alberta legislation or any other legislation right across Canada. They have no definition for it. However, bullying is a series of actions that we need to be aware of. Bullying is a form of harassment. Not
Mhm.
all harassment is bullying, but bullying is a form of harassment that would fall within the definitions of knows or ought reason to know would cause offense, humiliation, or intimidation. And so we use the Canadian Center for Occupational Health and Safety that they actually define bullying, and the key differences are that bullying is defined as a pattern of behavior. There's a
Yeah.
series of events
Yeah.
that take place, right?
Yeah.
And also that they define it it's intended. Now,
Mhm.
under legislation, we do not have to prove intent, right? It's
Mhm.
not in the legislation. It's not in the definitions of harassment. So I think it's important for investigators to understand what workplace bullying is. We teach this on our course, but also understand that it's not defined in Canadian law. But so we need to be aware of it. Harassment's defined in Canadian law.
Okay, so when a complaint comes in, how does HR or whoever's making the decision decide that it needs to be investigated versus just talking to the people involved and saying, and maybe saying, hey, so and so, cut it out?
Right.
Because I find it can get surprisingly confusing. My clients can find this quite confusing and perplexing.
Right. So what we teach is to start with a risk-informed approach, right?
Okay.
And so a risk-informed approach takes this approach of answering the question, if this is true, is it serious enough that we need to do a formal investigation? So, if true, could someone likely lose their job? If true, could we be sued? If true, could it be a human rights complaint? If true, could it be a WCB complaint? And then, if so, that gives them the framework within which to say we need to proceed formally versus informally. Most investigations or most complaints that come through, it's because you have a complainant that's making a formal complaint. And I also hear the other side where people say, well, HR tried to resolve this informally and it was just a big mess because I was
Mm,
forced to go into a mediation conversation, that type of thing. And so I really encourage taking a risk informed approach. Ask yourself, if this was true, we don't know yet, obviously,
yeah,
then are the consequences serious enough to say that we have to do a formal investigation?
I love that. Perfect. Okay. So, you a little bit already talked about the parties involved. Um, you talked about, well, actually, please go into that because I'm not sure you actually use the words complainant, respondent, investigator, stuff like that. Can you just quickly discuss the parties involved in the investigation?
Yeah, I mean, so sometimes you have a reporter. As an example, we've done many investigations where it's been what we call employer initiated. In other words, the reporter could be the HR manager, could be a manager, whatever. They're reporting the allegation. You might have a person that is the recipient of the bad behavior. They're now not a complainant because they haven't made the complaint, right?
Right.
So, but there's still someone that has evidence and information related to the complaint. And so you don't always need a complainant to initiate an investigation. And that was borne out in a case out of Ontario, a recent case out of Ontario that went through a whole different levels of appeal. And the findings at the at King's Bench Court was that organizations do not need a complainant to either cooperate or want to cooperate to initiate an investigation, right? The organization has the right to get to understand what took place. Then you have the respondent. Now, the respondent is generally, it defines as someone that is responding to the allegation, or they are the person alleged to have engaged in the misconduct. We don't use terms like victim. We don't use terms like perpetrator because those are terms that infer guilt. So we use neutral terms such as complainant, respondent, reporter, and witnesses.
So I'm going through the steps that you listed in the beginning. And now I want to talk about evidence and gathering evidence. So, what evidence do you need and how far do you have to go? What comes up for me sometimes is that you get a bunch of witnesses. Do you have to interview every single witness? Like, when can you stop?
Right. Yeah, so that's what's called sufficiency, right? So do you have sufficiency to come to a finding on the balance of probabilities? So let me give you an illustration. Let's say you had a room of 12 people at a meeting, and the boss yells, screams, swears, slams her fist on the and calls everybody a bunch of effing so and so's.
Yeah.
And there's a complaint. You don't need to interview all 12 because you might interview two or three and you might come to a finding that that is sufficient. And then of course you give the respondent the opportunity to respond to it. If there is conflicting evidence, that's where you have to kind of track it down, but you don't necessarily have to interview all 12 people. There's an example where you can come to sufficiency without having to, extend it to 10, 15, 20 interviews.
Right. Anything else you need to, tell us about evidence?
Yeah, and one of the things that I think oftentimes, particularly HR professionals that haven't had a lot of training, is that they think they have to have a smoking gun, right? So the idea that you have to have like irrefutable evidence, video or whatever it might be, photographs, and you don't. Evidence comes in all varying sizes of. We use the analogy of a grain of sand, a little pebble, a stone, and a great big rock. If you look at the scales of justice on the balance of probabilities, 5 grains of sand can actually tip the scales to come to a finding, meaning that you can have what's called circumstantial evidence. You can have evidence that you need to analyze it and be reasonable in your analysis, but you
Hmm.
don't need the smoking gun. All you need is sufficient evidence to be able to tip the scales in favor of one finding or the other.
Hmm. What about, and I guess sufficiency? I mean, you have to investigate all the evidence. You can't be selective, and I'm talking about due process or fair process in terms of if the respondent raises something, you have to
Right.
investigate that. You can't selectively say, "I've got my fine grains of
Right.
sand. I'm done." Do you want to
Yeah.
comment on that? Because I probably wasn't that eloquent.
You bet. I mean, what we recommend and what we do is we ask the parties, what evidence would you like us to consider in
Oh,
support of your version of events? We just ask them.
right.
And then, and if they say, well, I'd like you to talk to Mary or I'd like you to talk to Joe or, that type of thing, then we'll ask, well, what might Mary tell us? What might Joe tell us? And when we oftentimes get respondents that want us to interview a character reference, right?
Right.
So, well, talk to Mary. She'll tell you I'm not the type of guy to do that. Or talk to Joe. He'll tell you he's known me for 10 years and I've never done something like that. Well, to us, that is not relevant evidence because we're talking about a specific incident that may have happened. And so we want witnesses to that incident, right? So character evidence is really not relevant with respect to a finding of fact. It might be relevant when it comes to discipline sanction, but not in the finding of fact.
Ah, so interesting. So
Mhm.
much nuance to this. Okay. You already touched on it, but talk to me about the standard of proof in investigation.
Yeah, so the balance of probabilities really it's a much lower standard of proof than criminal case. Criminal case is beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a fairly high standard. The balance of probabilities really is what is more likely to have occurred than not. It's been described as, 51%. It's been described as 50% and a feather, tilting the scales of justice, right? Where do the
Right.
scales of justice tilt towards one version of events or another? It becomes challenging when you're at that 49-51. I mean, it's just a frame,
Right.
reference of frame, right? But so it can become challenging. But what happens is most inexperienced investigators, they're concerned about making that call because it is a call and you have to
Right.
do it from an analytical perspective. You have to do it from a reasonable perspective, but it is a call that we're saying we believe this person over the other person. Therefore, that we believe it's more likely to have occurred than not.
I find that in investigations where the consequences are going to be severe, loss of a job, say, for example, that somehow it feels like the standard of proof shifts, that you
Mm,
need to have better evidence because, the severity of the actions
right.
that are going to be taken. What's your
Right.
perspective on that?
Yeah, well, it's not just my perspective, but the perspective of the Supreme Court of Canada has reiterated that the standard of proof does not change, regardless of how serious the issue is, regardless of how
Okay.
serious the sanction might be coming out of it.
Mhm.
The standard is the standard is the standard. What happens is we get uncomfortable because if someone's going to lose their job based on our investigation, it become place a lot of pressure on somebody. And so it's about our comfort level versus what the courts have said. This is the standard of proof. And that's why it's so critical to do a proper investigation with credibility assessments, weigh out all the evidence, and show if it were ever to be challenged at arbitration or ever to be challenged in courts or wherever, that we've done our proper due diligence to come to that finding. But the standard's the same, whether it be high seriousness or low seriousness.
So now talking about the report, I don't know, actually, no, I guess this is kind of at the finding stage of your process, but the report, what makes a solid investigation report and what mistakes do you see? Because I imagine you have an opportunity to review past investigation
hmm
reports.
Yeah, I've been asked to redo investigations, and I've also been asked to provide expert opinion evidence on flawed reports, mishandled investigations, where it's resulted in a lawsuit and those types of things. And so I've done three of those, and so, what we look for first and foremost is whether or not the investigator applied that open minded test. So, whether or not there's apprehensions of bias coming out of their investigation. And of course, that
Mm,
has to be articulated in the report. A poorly articulated report, the investigation could have been done well, but if the report doesn't articulate it well, it raises a whole bunch of red flags that might raise a reasonable apprehension of bias. It might raise, the question of the competency of the investigator, those types of things. I mean, the report should clearly identify the methodology used, right?
mhm,
So, in terms of what you did, how you did it, how you came to a finding, why you came to a finding, and what the findings are, obviously. And it should be very clear to the reader, okay, this was done well, this was done thoroughly. I see now, again, I teach on my course that if it's a low risk case,
Hmm.
And, if worst case scenario, if true, someone's going to get a written warning, or, maybe a 1 day suspension or something like that. Obviously you might not put the energy and effort into a 40-page report.
Right.
But if it's high risk, if someone's likely to get terminated, or it's likely to get grieved, or it's likely to,
Litigated.
get become a lawsuit, then the investigator needs to put the work in to make sure that that investigative report shows, and it's also proactive. It also shows potential lawyers that you know what you're doing.
Right.
And we do hundreds of investigations a year, over 300 a year, and not one have we had overturned or scrutinized at a higher level. The courts, the arbitrators, because what happens is usually the lawyers involved in those processes, they look at a report and they say, this is a very well done report, very well done investigation. So you mitigate the risk of being challenged in courts by having a proper, thorough investigation and report.
Now, you as an investigator, what role do you play? Use the sixth step of discipline or sanctions. What role do you play in that?
Well, we discourage sanction recommendations. We do not provide recommendations. And in fact, I don't think an investigator should provide recommendations, because it's a very different hat. And what it can do is, if I provide a recommendation on discipline sanction, it could raise this apprehension of bias, that I have this opinion that this person should be terminated, those types of things. We want to reduce that. However, the role we play on that final last component, that discipline sanction, is we identify any aggravating or mitigating factors that the decision maker should take into consideration. I'll give you an example of an aggravating factor. If we have a case where it's pretty clear, and we have a strong case that something took place, and we have an absence of remorse, person's not taking responsibility for their behavior, they're maybe
Hmm.
attacking the credibility of the complainant, that's an aggravating factor. A mitigating factor, on the other hand, could be someone saying something like, I had a really bad day and I lost my temper, I lost my cool, I've been under a lot of stress, and I want to apologize to the folks, and I want to make it right. That's a mitigating factor.
Yeah.
If that comes out in the investigation, we place the aggravating mitigating factors that we see, observe, listen to in our reports for the decision maker to make the right decision.
Right. So you'll have a section of, aggravating, mitigating factors, and you'll
That's
list
right.
them. Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Uh, when can someone do an investigation internally? And when should they hire an outsider? I think I know what your answer is going to be, at least partly, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and again, we just really encourage people to take a risk-informed approach. If this is a
Right.
high-risk case where, let's say, it's involving an allegation against the vice president having an affair with their executive assistant, who is now bullying some of the other, those type of things, right? Like, it's kind of kind of be facetious a little bit, but past the pay grade of the average HR professional. It's like, this is high
Right.
risk. Right.
Yes.
So when you
Hmm.
look at, once again, if true, have a risk informed lens. Is it high risk? If it is, we should probably go external to the experts. If it's low risk and we can do this ourselves, and we have sufficient training, and we've done investigations and we know what we're doing, then obviously they would want to take it in internally, because of cost, right? I mean, that's usually the big factor, is the cost of going external versus doing it internally. But what they really should consider is the risk.
Right.
Anything sexual is high risk, and
Yes.
that should not be in the hands of someone that doesn't have the proper training and experience.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. So that brings us to the end of this. That was just so useful. So much packed in to get into
Good.
that. I loved it. Okay. So where can someone find you in Veritas?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously online, we've got our brand new website, or refreshed website. So, veritussolutions.net, LinkedIn, make contact with me on LinkedIn. I'm quite active in putting material out there in terms of relevant material to what we're discussing. And
Hmm.
yeah, just Google us and give us a call if we can help.
Yes. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you. I will put links to all of that in the show notes. Well, thanks, Bob. There was so much packed into that. I love that. That was great. There's so many parts that I'm thinking about, but the part I'm thinking about was near the beginning, where that point he made that you don't always need a complainant to trigger an investigation. And I know that's true. It's happened to me in my consulting roles. So think about that. Bob and I referred to this at the beginning, did an episode on credibility assessments, and it's the most popular episode I have ever done. And a link to that is right here or in my listed episodes. That's it for today, though. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.